The Terrible Vast Pyre of Chief Mechanist Kirlisoveyitch by Rachel A. Brune. The intricacies of grief transwhelmed this moment into the monochromed gilt of clockwork landscape. Ticking time in heartbeats, unsteady under copper clouds, held bursting in these lungs of red iron chains. The killing time began again as the Clockwork Bear awoke in his mountain of rough iron. The knowledge seeped into the city, subsuming the rhythm of industry and speech into the barely heard heartbeat of clock-step marching. "The Pyre are massing again," the woman in the red dress pronounced the second syllable with the affected long A that was all the rage these days among the upper class, comprised of those with enough money to do nothing inside the winter walls of steam and steel. She stepped back from the window as her breath frosted thick on the pane. The man in the black suit looked up from his newspaper, sighing. She paled against the curtains, drawing them back against the glass. He narrowed his eyes at the affectation. It glared garish and obvious against the images holding his mind in thrall. Kirlisoveyitch was dead. It looked like he had punched his own ticket. It happened. The days of darkness sometimes weighed heavily on the soul, and the fires lit in the great caverns of steel could not warm the mind as they did flesh and metal. Still, the news came as a surprise and would no doubt cause great disconcertment in the camps. He folded the newspaper and placed it into his leather satchel, tying the clasp with a thin piece of twine. The copper buckle had broken years ago, and he had not bothered to replace it. "Karl," the woman said, "be careful." He nodded without replying. Swirling his greatcoat about him, he settled it on his shoulders and pulled the tall fur hat snugly over his ears. The gas in the street lights flickered and guttered as he made his way through the half-lit streets. At this early time of night, commotion was not unusual, but the snow that continued to fall made it unlikely. Still, if the massing continued, he expected his journey would be delayed by half as long as it took the Kirlisoveyitch to quell the careful demonstration. The long street with its well-kempt rows of brick encased in wrought iron finally ended, the cobblestones giving way to the slush-encrusted dirt of a wide parade square illuminated by a bonfire encased in a giant copper furnace. The buildings surrounding the square hunched in the darkness, their windows illuminated every so often by sparks of reflection that thrust their way through the gloom and smoke that overhung the parade field. Lined in gleaming ranks before the fire, 3-meter-tall Pyre waited in their dominant copper lines. Snowflakes brushed the air around them, fading into water and drizzle in the heat thrown off by the metal giants. Something in his stride kept the few human observers from straying too near his steps. Their presence was a redundancy, a simple fail-safe, and they sensed in his stride a subtle danger to their careful chaos. "Good evening, comrade engineer." He was unwilling to slow his steps, but the man's voice held exactly the right mix of address and deference. The man grasped his fur-lined uniform cap, lifting it exactly the right distance from his head. His other hand grasped a small wooden box. "Good evening, maestro," he replied, nodding his head. "Yuri," the man said, replacing his capot. "Maestro Yuri." Impressive display. "Thank you." Maestro Yuri bobbed his head. "Will you be observing the demonstration?" "Regretfully no," Karl said, offering no further explanation. The maestro bobbed his head again and gave a short bow. He turned back to the square, flipping open his box. He waited for his control gears to emerge. He grabbed the control, insulated in its rubber tube, and shifted it into position. Nodding to his fellow controllers positioned at the corners of the square, the maestro pressed a small, tear-shaped button. Behind him, Karl heard the muffled roar of lubricated joints and metal meeting the packed snow on earth of the parade field as the rows of Pyre began stamping their feet in unison. An unearthly scream followed his own footsteps as he stepped off, lost and silent in the still falling snow. He shook his head, clearing it of the smoke and sound. His stomach growled. Not many people still attended these organized demonstrations in full anymore. Most simply showed their faces for the morning reconciliation. He would have to eat on the train. The railhead was nestled deep within the dirigible yards. The narrow path traversed the canyons of steep wood and metal landing platforms. Hundreds of structures reached up toward the sky, lost in the low-lying clouds that held back the snow for a moment. Between some of the platforms, the bellies of the dirigibles poked through the cloud cover, like a pregnant woman caught en Pxabay after her bath. Gas lamps lit the platforms, fading as the distance doubled. They stood, solemn custodians of the yards, reminding those seeking the station that the reach of the Empire extended much further than the tracks earlier dynasties had laid. Any person wishing to travel would thus be reminded of the extent of the bear's embrace, and the futility of trying to escape it. Karl paused for a moment in the dark. He removed his hat, shaking the moisture from it against his leg. The glint of gaslight on steel caught his eye. The poyezd stood in heavy ranks in front of the dirigible platforms, waiting for the operators to set the blood spark that would jolt them to mechanical life. The lanky matnes rested silently, joints gleaming with the lubricants necessary to keep them mobile as they operated the leviathans through the tropical environments of water and salt. The red Cyrillic lettering across their chests identified them as the tangible final products of his collective. Karl had seen the flickering images of silver and light, projected by the operators who returned, wasted and malformed from the incredible explorations that sent the tendrils of glory and fame trickling back to the Empire on the shoulders of those strange creatures, twisted and scarred by their travels under inhospitable climes. He passed a small cohort of operators, swarming down from their airship. They were swarthy, dressed in the silks of the East under their fur and leather. Most of the members of their ranks came from the subjugated countries of the Far East, their inhabitants accustomed by destiny and national predilection to travel beyond the confines of the Empire's domain, and missed less sorely when they failed to return. As he passed, the three men swept their conical hats into deep obsolescence, then jumped back up as he continued by, unheeding. He heard the rattling of their keys and vials as they scurried off to continue the preparations for this new journey. Karl had heard rumors of the great exploration. He had forgotten what number this was. There had been too many to count. Similar voyages had spent years mapping the North African tribal lands, questing deep into the continent in search of the hidden origin of the Nile. He had little personal use for these journeys of strange, fantastic sunlight and fields of lush, organic soil. Not for him rivers that ran muddy beneath the midday sky, even though rumors spread like oil on water about the great river on the new continent that promised a great green wealth of discovery. His interest in these voyages stemmed rather more from business instincts than any romantic or patriotic feeling. He rarely admitted this fact in polite conversation, and tended, in fact, to avoid most attempts at such. He no longer suffered the snide remarks concerning his bourgeoisie affiliations. His Teutonic legacy was evident in his name, but his science had been sufficient to make his way through the upper echelons of, if not society, then at least those necessary for the greatness of the Empire. He emerged from the forest of steel and stamped his way up the steps of the depot, shaking snow from his boots at each platform. The mighty ranks of the poyezd and their faithful herder operators faded behind him. Karl had built a great collective from the ashes of Germany's subjugation. The chief mechanist had been the key. His loss was unexplainable and, perhaps, irrecoverable. A vast, cold emptiness stretched before Karl, formed from the absent answer to the questions raised by the paper he still carried tucked into his aging satchel. The whispers started when he reached the camp. They swirled up with gusts of snow that marked his path from the sleigh. The workhorses tossed their heads, the lubrications firing behind their eyes. Karl stepped well away from them as he disembarked the sleigh. The bitter cold of the Northlands sometimes played havoc on their gears, one of the reasons he traveled by rail and sleigh rather than trust the mighty air engines crafted in his own collective. The snow collected on his shoulders and in top of his boots, and he trudged the short distance to the small wooden headquarters building. Brigadier Lev, in a resplendent commandant's uniform that had seen better days, did not bother to get up from the table. He poured a glass of vodka and pushed it toward Karl. "You know what the workers are saying?" he asked. Karl took the vodka. "Enlighten me, Brigadier." Lev whispered the name so softly, it was lost in a gust of wind that shook the flimsy structure. The small fire burning in the metal stove guttered, died, and was reborn as the wind left it. "Old wives' tales," Karl said, "told by the enslaved to put unease into the hearts of their conquerors." He sniffed the vodka. With a shrug, he tossed the contents of the glass. The liquid was lost in the myriad stains already adorning the wooden floor. Karl set the glass back on the table. Lev stared at him, perhaps regretting the loss of offering. "Come with me, Brigadier," said Karl. The wind shook the building once again, and Karl thought fleetingly that perhaps the cold was the cause of the commandant's pale cheek. Comrade Engineer, perhaps I should—" "Brigadier, the newspaper informs me a man is dead in your camp," Karl said. "Not just any man. Kirlisoveyitch is dead. Your failure to resolve the cause of this matter is grounds for demotion at the least." What the worst might be he left unspoken. Lev asked no more questions, but grabbed the bottle from the table, plopped a fur cap over his bald head, and bowed low. "Permit me to accompany you, Comrade Engineer." "Have a man see to the workhorses." Karl had not even bothered to remove his gloves. "I'll need them for my return." The two men left the lights and nominal warmth of the building behind them. Not far from the headquarters, they met a short, rather obese man hurrying toward the building. He waddled up, doffing his cap, bowing to the two. He caught a good look at Karl and bowed even deeper. Karl observed that the motion uprooted his shirt from his pants to expose his skin to the snow, which now fell in earnest. "Dog!" Lev kicked snow at the man. "See to the Comrade Engineer's workhorses." Dog smiled and bowed again, then leapt to gather the steamworks under his care. "He is not quite right in the senses," Lev said, following Karl's stare, mistaking impatience for concern. "But he has a gift with the machines." "I do not wish to stand in the snow to discuss your men," Karl said. "Where is Kirlisoveyitch?" "His body was taken on the last barge to Moscow," Lev said. "His paperwork was in order, and he had family there." Karl frowned. "Don't worry, Comrade Engineer," Lev hastened to assure him. "We have graphed everything, preserving it in the nitrate archives." "Take me to his shop." Karl had been there before, but during the long twilight several summers ago. The night and the snow had claimed any last bit of familiarity he once had with this particular camp. "This way," Brigadier Lev said. Karl noticed the sideways glance Lev cast outside the camp as he turned to lead the way further into the maze of the collective. He followed the brigadier's gaze, but all he noted were the shadows that moved with the snow and the spotlights of the perimeter fence. The fence was only recently built. It was not a prison fence, and if one looked closely, one could discern that it had been set in a defensive posture rather than one to indicate confinement. In the past few years, wolves had discovered the grounds and had come out of the pines under the new moon to find those who stumbled, lost in the solace of sleep or drink. The collective sent hunting parties after the wolves. They armed themselves with the latest long arms, with the rifled barrels that sent bullets flying further and truer than ever before, fed by the breech-loading magazines that sent the rounds through the weapon with the mechanical surety of their larger cousins, the dirigible crew arms. Then they had sent rescue parties after those hunting parties and found only blood and tracks in the snow. Some of those tracks had not seemed particularly wolf-like, and now the felling crews would venture out only under cover of the sun, with as many armed guards as could be spared from the few that roamed the camp. The area beyond the fence had been cleared 50 meters out, where the fallen snow met a dense ring of pine trees. They stood, almost impenetrable, silent in the hush of the steady snowfall. The forest wall was broken only in one place, where the river Magna flowed out of the woods on its meandering way through the camp, carrying on her back the great black barges of coal and steel. The white-capped waters masked green, dark, muscular power that kept the stream turning the mill, and the coals glowing in the great furnaces of the machine. The main camp factory was built right over the river, and this was where Kirlisoveyitch had spent his days overseeing the powerful melding of metal and gears into the strange shapes that guided the great airships. "As you can see, we have suffered no great loss of productivity, comrade engineer," Lev spoke as they made their way onto the great floor. The night shift bent their backs to the coals and metal, looking like a great poster of the Empire meant to show the gleaming march of progress in the sweat and metal of its workers. "I expect your productivity to be maintained," Karl replied mildly. "What I am lacking are answers as to why my chief mechanist is no longer here to supervise production." Lev gave his answer in the staccato shadow of the tick that jumped in his cheek. The whispers had infiltrated his awareness. He had been in the camps too long, and Karl knew that there was no place outside of them for such a man as this. The brigadier lowered his head and mumbled the word once again. His voice was lost in the great din of the shop. Karl cut him off with an abrupt gesture. "I wish to see Kirlisoveyitch's shop." The brigadier led the way across the great shop floor. The whispers followed them. The workers scarcely ceased their labors, but Karl felt their eyes on his back, and their speculation in the murmurs that moved under the sounds of distressed metal. "Up here." The word accompanied every mysterious happening that chanced to occur in the northern nightlands. It infected the camps, passing from one mind to another, germinating in the ever-fertile imaginations of the men who lived in the dark and the snow. Curly had dismissed such stories, as he dismissed any such things that set his great factory in delay. Karl had hired him for his unique scientific perspective and brute disregard for peasant superstition, and had been well satisfied. But the whispers persisted even under the glare of the coals that powered the great machines that signaled to the world the dawn of a new age, a new empire, no longer held in thrall by superstition and things that left strange marks in the snow. When the camp was first built, Karl had often frequented Kirlisoveyitch's shop. He had been younger then, a student of the philosophy that men worked more diligently when their masters were about. Such would give them encouragement and show them that they were loved. Karl had found the chief mechanist a rare, vast talent that spoke to the scientist in terms of brotherly understanding, an understanding that could be mistaken for deeper affection. Karl was older now, and cared no more for such philosophies. He no longer had the inclination to spend his winters in the cold soot of the mills or the sweat-streaked hells of the factories. As such, the disorder and chaos of the space caused him to miss his tread in the door. "What is this?" Karl asked, astonished. "This is the Comrade Chief Mechanist's shop." Lev sweated even in the cold. Karl swore a deep German oath that passed outside of Lev's understanding. Surely this is not how he left his affairs. Lev stared at him. Karl noticed the brigadier still held the bottle of vodka in the pocket of his coat, clutching it as if waiting for an opportune moment to take a stealthy draught. "No one has been in here since the body was taken away," Lev said. "Since Kirlisoveyitch was taken away." Karl kept his voice tight, unemotional. "Yes, comrade engineer." The understanding of the correction once again slid past the brigadier's comprehension, and Karl was suddenly tired of his presence. "Wait for me outside, brigadier." Lev nodded and stepped quickly outside, closing the door behind him. Karl felt the relief emanating from the man, both from the removal of his presence and for the opportunity to revisit the bottle. Karl removed his leather gloves, tucking them deep into one of his pockets, and rubbed the bridge of his nose with 2 fingers, then passed the palm of his hand over his chin. "Comrade Chief Mechanist," Karl mused absently, "what was it you feared so greatly you did not even send word before cutting your own thread?" No answer came in return, not even a whisper from the wind that piled snow around the wide glass windows. Karl looked up. The glass had to be quite thick to withstand the winter storms. It was held in place by many sturdy iron supports, steeply ramped to allow the snow to slide to the gutters. On the clear night it would be quite beautiful. Under the sun it would be so bright as to be intolerable. Instinctively he shuttered his eyes and directed his gaze downward again. A stale copper scent drew his attention. The brown stain, the splatter punctuated by scabby pulp, coated the papers piled deep on the long table. The weapon lay to the side. It was a large pistol, the handle engraved with vines, pearl inlay set in around 2 Cyrillic characters. Karl picked it up, feeling the heft of the gun in his hand. He looked more closely at the engravings, recognizing the depiction. It was the Firebird, the great creation immortalized by the strings of the favored son of the Empire. Karl wondered if there was some meaning behind that, or if the pistol was merely a convenient means to an end. With one long fingernail, Karl scratched at the stain, curious. The long sheet of yellowing vellum appeared rather intact, and he could make out the long red lines underneath the dried gore. The red prints emerged rather slowly from scratching, and he found a rag, soaked it in the steam bath, and wiped gently at the parchment. It was high quality. The blood streaked away, leaving the vellum and printing intact. Nothing. Or rather, a very mundane something. The sheaf of long parchment was merely a routine update of the intricate gears that blood-sparked the Paradimentines. While the street theater matinees were one of the main productions of this collective, Karl suspected that his chief mechanist did not kill himself over what were essentially gigantic metal puppets. "Brigadier Lev!" Karl raised his voice to be heard through the door. There was a short delay and a fumbling with the doorknob. When Lev came back into the shop, the vodka bottle was not quite settled in his pocket. Karl winced as the man gasped, grabbed, and missed at the bottle. It fell to the floor with a thump, but without the expected shatter. Lev turned red, scooped it back up, and settled it back into his jacket. "Brigadier," Karl said, "was Kirlisoveyitch working on anything else? Were any of his designs removed from this shop?" "Oh no, Comrade Engineer," Lev said. "Everything is as we found it." Curious. Karl took his gloves from his pocket and began putting them back on. "The chief mechanist I knew was always so—" he trailed off. "We did allow men into the shop to remove the body," Lev said. Karl turned on him, anger strengthening the lines of his face. "What did they touch?" "Just the table where he was found," Lev cowered, his eyes wide, crouching before Karl's sudden ferocity. "And some of the equipment. They moved it only to remove the body." "The body?" Karl's jaw tightened. "Oh, don't worry," Lev said, once again misinterpreting the comrade engineer's reaction. "We have the archives, very thorough, yes, before we even removed the remains to be prepared for their journey." Karl straightened. The smell and taste of blood was in his senses, mingled with the faint odor of the burning gas from the lamps. It sickened him with its familiar miasma. He closed his eyes. He had seen much worse, but he did not want to see this. The nitrate archives. The process was new and so prohibitively expensive as to limit its use to the very upper ranks of the Empire, and, of course, the collective that was so recently home to the mind that birthed the technology. Karl stood at the reader, selecting and moving lenses for optimum magnification. When he found the sharpness required, he straightened briefly, allowing his eyes to rest in the gloom from the reflected white lights of the film. Lev stared at him, less an act of curiosity than a miniature trance brought on by boredom and sobriety. He spared a moment to wonder at the other man's perception of him. Tall, white hair, pale skin under his thick black furs and leather greatcoat. He had once selected his dress for the purpose of cutting an imposing figure. What was formerly intentional was now habit, and his manners and posture followed suit. He abruptly turned back to the lenses. "These are all the archives set down in the room?" "Yes, Comrade Engineer," Lev said. "Who made the imprints?" Karl asked. "Kirlisoveyitch's assistant." Lev's hand strayed to the pocket holding the bottle. "He taught him how to use the apparatus and imprint the archives on the nitrate." Kirli had an assistant. Karl looked up sharply, raising one thin eyebrow. "Someone to help in his shop, yes, Comrade Engineer." Lev's voice lifted, almost whining, and he shifted uneasily. "He was the one who found the body." Karl bent his head back to the lens. The archives showed him nothing unexpected. Whoever this assistant was, he knew both how to work the apparatus as well as the necessary frames to archive the incident. The archive of the workshop was clear and sharp, with no fuzzy or blurry images throughout the entire lens to suggest the presence of anything remotely uncanny. Karl had heard of extremely wealthy patrons who amused themselves by tricking the archives with ghost images. He had been disinvited from these parties at which his collective science played the role of honored guest after he'd remarked that the ghosts looked like nothing more than simple flares that sometimes occurred when archiving in the bright sunshine. The only ghost in this image was the body that lay heavy in the frame, dwarfed by the imposing architecture of the shop. Without lifting his gaze, Karl slipped the thick paper and silver archive out from beneath the lens and fixed a new one into the slot. A stark image of death greeted him. He had not realized until this moment, but he had been hoping for some small proof that this death, at least, had not been self-inflicted. That the last man Karl had counted on to remind him of his own humanity had not snuffed out his own blood spark. But the archive bore its silent, stubborn witness. He felt hope flicker and die out like the gas lamps in the winter ration periods. "Comrade Engineer?" Lev's voice broke the silence Karl had not realized had settled around them. This deep in the bowels of the building, the wind was muted. The only sound in the room was the faint humming. He realized it was the great engines of the mill churning in their furnaces. Karl lifted his head, gazing blankly past Lev. Who was his assistant? "Dog," Lev replied. "I wish to speak to him." Karl shifted his gaze to meet Lev's eyes. Lev nodded. "Yes, Comrade Engineer, of course." The Brigadier led him up the stairs, back onto the main factory floor. The smell of grease and other lubricants lay cold on the concrete. The Comrade Engineer's suspicions went whispering through the imposing structures of metal and ice, where men labored like ants on the giant leviathans that brought the conquered bear to her subjugated peoples. Below the whispers, the captive waters of the River Magna hurried the current along as workers unloaded the incoming barges and replaced their raw cargoes with the technology of the Empire. Karl kept his distance from the running waters. His eyes observed the clockwork precision of the laborers, but his mind was consumed with the need to understand. Brigadier Lev led the way back out of the great shop. Karl followed at a distance, just long enough to discourage any attempts at conversation or explanation. There was very little Lev could say now, in any case. Once out of the heat of the shop, the cold reasserted itself. The snow continued to fall thickly, haloing the perimeter fence spotlights. An unearthly howl stopped Lev in his tracks. Karl heard the faint click of one of the repeater long arms in the perimeter tower. Lev, Karl, the tower guards, all froze in tableau to see what might emerge. A curious call, almost a questing sort of whine, carried through the cold night air, muffled by the storm but still audible. "Brigadier!" Karl's voice jolted the man back to awareness. "Let us continue before I am frozen to the very ground." "Yes, Comrade Engineer." Lev started walking again, a short fumbling stride. Karl noted that he never took his eyes off the perimeter as they made their way past the pine woods. "A bear." Karl shook his head at the thought of it. It seemed every year the peasants dreamed up one more fairy tale goblin to populate the dark woods at the edge of the camp. If this were 20 years ago, There might have been someone living outside the walls of the collective. They would have been spies or more likely saboteurs, although their numbers had dwindled. Many of them now resided in the same camps they sought to overthrow. All had learned the futility of dancing with the bear. Dog's billet was a small room off one of the main barracks buildings. Karl questioned the fat little man's solitary quarters, but Lev assured him that he had been steadfastly ejected from every other billet. As an adept and assistant as he was to Kirlisoveyitch, no one else in the camp wished to remain in his presence for an overabundance of time. Upon stepping into the room, Karl understood why. The man popped up from his chair, bearing obsequiously and smiling in a vacuous manner guaranteed to creep the blood of any normal man. The gas burning in the pair of wall sconces barely illuminated the room, instead merely adding to the sour smell of the filth. Lev hesitated in the threshold. "Wait for me outside, Brigadier," Karl said. "Close the door behind you." Lev sighed in what might have been relief, his hands closing over the bottle in his jacket even before the door was shut firmly behind him. Dog sat back down on his stool, his feet barely touching the floor. He swung them back and forth like a child while he waited expectantly, staring unashamed at Karl. The comrade engineer ignored the assistant's presence for a moment, allowing his eyes to adjust to the gloom in the small apartment. It did not take long. He realized what he took at first for darkness were actually shadows that congealed along walls piled from floor to ceiling with shelves and shelves of clutter and junk. Dog kept smiling, although his feet swung faster and faster as Karl moved closer to the shelves, reaching out a hand to sort through some of the junk. The collection had been there for a very long time. Some of the debris was coated in dust several inches thick, while other pieces gleamed lubricated metal in the reflection from the gas lamps. "This is your own private little workshop, isn't it?" Karl asked the little goblin of a creature, who grinned and nodded back. "You collect all manner of gears and clockwork, eh?" Dog nodded again, or rather paused in his nodding, and then started up again. He smiled wider, and Karl realized that he nodded because with his stump of a tongue he could no longer speak. An odd feeling of distaste overwhelmed Karl. He wanted to leave the tiny, dirty room with the half-idiot grinning his child's grin, sitting, waiting. He swallowed the gorge that rose in his throat and coughed gently to clear it. "You helped Chief Mechanist Kirlisoveyitch in his shop, didn't you?" Karl spoke to Dog as he imagined one would speak to a child. Dog nodded and smiled. A gurgling sound came from his throat at the mention of his former master. Something rustled in the corner of the room. It was too dark for vision to penetrate the gloom, but the sound caught Karl's attention. "Did the chief mechanist ever give you papers?" Karl used his hands with the long, thin fingers to describe what he was looking for. "They would be about the size of 3 books put together, with images, lines, drawn on them in red." Dog nodded again and smiled. Karl closed his mouth around a snarled curse. He was severely discomfited. He never used profanity. The smell of the room thickened, if that were possible, the thick air almost a taste in his mouth. "Where?" Karl asked. "Get them for me." The tone of his command finally struck the smile from Dog's face. The little ogre hopped off his stool, his face a picture of reproach from the man who spoke to him thus. Karl heard rustling, chattering, more of the peculiar guttural chortling. The room did not seem so large as to allow the man to disappear from his sight, but it was a long moment before Dog reappeared from the shadows, clutching several scrolls and sheaves of vellum. Karl went to take them, but Dog stopped short just out of reach. "Give those to me." Karl held out a gloved hand. Dog shook his head, obstinate. "Chief Mechanist Kirlisoveyitch was my friend," Karl said. "If he gave those to you, he meant for you to keep them safe for me." Dog looked at him doubtfully, then down at the pages he held clenched in his stubby fingers. Karl noted with distaste that several of the prints were permanently creased from his crushing grip. Finally, Dog extended his arm to Karl, who took the prints. Dog shuffled backwards from his reach, a curious light burning in his eyes as he watched the comrade engineer leave the room. As the door closed, The light burned brighter, as if someone had turned a flame under some gas lamp, before burning out completely. Karl waited until he was back inside the flimsy headquarters building before removing his gloves and unrolling the printed pages with their promised designs. He could tell Brigadier Liev was burning with an almost unseemly curiosity, but banished the Commandant to his small room. Lev's presence in the company of Kirlisoveyitch's last masterpiece was unwelcome. The final unrolling of the parchment on the steady table was anticlimactic. There was no grand flourishes to accompany the reveal. Even the wind that had so buffeted the structure earlier in the night seemed to have died quietly. In his small room, nursing the last of his pathetic bottle, Brigadier Lev paused. He held his breath without realizing it. The sound coming from the outer room was a mixture of triumph and grief, expressions he had not thought the great comrade engineer capable of making. Alone, Comrade Engineer Karl von Tauben gazed at his late friend's greatest success. A shudder went through him as he traced the fallen red lines with one manicured finger. Here was the great weapon he had sought, the most powerful ever designed. This would be the legacy of his collective. This would be the legacy of the great Adamantones. And the Empire would forever equate the victory of the bear with the vindication of his camps. Karl delved into the ever more intricate designs. He read them in a great, terrible destruction. The final matinee, a weapon too great to be used, too terrible not to be built. A strange excitement kindled in him, paled his cheek in the overwhelming ferment that agitated his desire. An indescribable sound echoed through the camp, muffled below the soft wind and the snow that continued to fall silently. The men on the shop floor momentarily paused, feeding the great giant beasts their diet of coal. In his tiny apartment, Dog hesitated before adding his own weird chortle to the sound, hooting along as it rose and fell. Across the perimeter, the tower guards lifted and primed their long barrels, tense in the dark. In his own small room, Brigadier Lev fingered the small-caliber pistol tucked into the drawer of the table next to his desk. The Commandant crossed himself in an unconscious gesture he had learned and forgotten many years before. Karl threw the pages to the ground in a gesture of casual hatred. He swallowed back his agitation, the excitement that still crawled along his limbs. The Adamantones would never be built. Not in the anticipated future of the von Tauben collective. The designs captured in the painstakingly formed red lines were too advanced for even the great craftsmen that toiled on the floors of the Comrade Engineer. The machines to build these beasts would have to be designs themselves. The success was incomplete, and so the chief mechanist had met with failure. The minute progress grasped and eked by the Comrade Engineer and his workers would be set back so many years. It would be a wonder if they received any of the great commissions from the Empire for another 100 years. Karl steadied himself on the table with both hands. If he were extremely unlucky, the collective and all of its great machines would pass into the hands of another. He bared his teeth and hissed. The whispers. Did the entire camp know of what Kirlisoveyitch had discovered? Did they thus understand the choice he had made? Karl had come to the camp with his unspoken hope, and been met with the cold red iron of certainty. Curly had been a suicide. That much was certain. Hiring Curly had been the closest Karl had ever come to having a brother. He had killed himself knowing the failure would certainly bring Karl to the camp. And though Karl surely loved the chief mechanist as well as he could, there would have been no way to spare him the consequences of that failure. His last act of design had been to free Karl of that onerous duty of killing his friend. Herr Comrade Engineer? Brigadier Lev stood at the door, uncertain. Karl turned slowly to face him, and Lev saw his face, ravaged with the attempt to express the grief that lay cold on the snow. As the brigadier stared, the skin around the engineer's eyes lifted and twisted. The corners of his mouth turned, and he smiled. The grimace offered promises of blood and iron and in that one glimpse Lev understood that the shadows to fear lay not beyond the ring of pines 50 meters outside the camp, but had been brought to the collective in the person of its overlord. Karl mounted the sleigh. The workhorses were primed and eager to be off, clanking their gears and steam snorting in anticipation. There was no sign of dog, but Karl did not worry. The little man would either die of cold and exposure, or return to the forest from where he had surely come. The shadows watching the camp would soon make their cold way in to reclaim the clearing from which they had only temporarily been banished. The buildings behind him lay stiff and silent. The great engines of the camp shop still churned. The current of the river and embers of the coal would power them until they fell to disrepair and ruin. The sympathetic flames leaping from the roof of the shop, gathering the barracks, the headquarters building, the stables, and the carefully built towers of the perimeter fence into the fire's embrace. This was Comrade Engineer Karl von Tauben's last great gift to the man who had come closest to the appellation of friend. The cold body of the chief mechanist made its way somewhere in the night along the waters of the River Magna. But his cenotaph would be read here, not as a cold granite monument, but in the death and fire of the great collective. Chief Machinist Kirlisoveyitch's last design curled and crumpled in the flames, an offering on the pyre to the gods of the age of steam and steel. The comrade engineer lit the spark in the warhorses. The dawn was close, although the blizzard tamped out any light under its lashings of rain-driven snow. The workhorses stamped their feet as they started off through the cold, which failed to reach the blood of the man in the sleigh. The satisfaction of his hunger burned him from the inside, illuminating the frustrated anger and despair that followed him from the camp. In the tracks of the sleigh, the blood ran deep black against the moonlit snow, taking its true red form only when the firelight kissed it briefly before dying into embers.